Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this week we heard from our friends at Magellan Limited. Now, Magellan, for those of you who don't know, are the deep sea exploration company. They're very good at doing things that make ship nerds like us very happy. They made a whole bunch of announcements this week. So the first was that they'd been to the Bismarck last year and filmed the wreck. Now, I'm sure I don't actually need to introduce the Bismarck. It's one of history's most famous ships. It's a ship that I was obsessed with when I was a kid. And I'm sure many of you have a similar kind of story. But if I'm laughing, it's because I'm excited. This is really exciting news. They've also announced that Bismarck will be part of their vROV pilot experience. We can actually fly around the wreck as part of a program simulating what it's like to fly or pilot an ROV exploring an underwater wreck like Bismarck. They also announced that the Titanic debris field, or at least a big chunk of it, is also coming to vROV pilot. So that's extremely exciting. We'll obviously do a video about that closer to the date when we know more about it. But today I thought it would be good to look at some of the footage that Magellan have released of their time on the Bismarck wreck. So I'm just going to let this roll in the background. I'm not going to pretend that I haven't seen this before, because the truth is we've actually been directly assisting Magellan with some of their work. Now, they've got a team of researchers and, ROV pilots, very talented people on board who really know what they're doing. And we've been able to kind of provide some points of interest on the Bismarck wreck. So when I say we, I mean specifically myself and our good friend, researcher and historian, the author Joe Lavender, who knows the Bismarck story better than most. He's written quite an impressive book about it. So Joe and I were invited by Magellan to actually observe this as it was happening. So I just want you to keep in mind, this footage that we're getting right now is part of a flyover that Magellan did, and we were basically live streaming while they were doing this on the bottom of the North Atlantic. We were, invited to sit down and watch as it was happening, and we actually gave some instruction to the ROV pilot to look at certain things and to fly around. First of all, it's extremely impressive what they're able to do. So, it's very hard to pilot one of these things and keep it in a straight line because there's a current. You can actually see the little bits of sediment and things just kind of drifting past there. There's obviously a current. They're, operating 5 kilometers deep. This is very, very difficult to pull off, but full credit where credit is due. Magellan's team are really, really good at doing exactly this. They know their trade. So, where are we? This is the bow of the Bismarck. This is just behind the forecastle deck, and we have just flown over turret A's barbette. So I'm just going to go back to that for a minute because there are a couple of things that I thought were quite interesting. Straight away, I'm just going to pause it. You notice the degree of preservation is really, really remarkable. And, Bismarck has been explored before by James Cameron, David Mearns, selection of the underwater greats. A lot of this footage has never been seen before. This is what's quite unique about Magellan's visit last year, is they've captured virtually, in beautiful HD, huge chunks of the ship that we can now sit back and analyze. And part of their plan is to release some of this to their patrons, to their supporters, and get it out to the public like this in, digestible chunks so we can learn more about the Bismarck. And what's amazing is the degree of preservation. You saw it in Cameron's documentary back in the early 2000s, but it's been 20 years since then, and you can still see the paint on the barbette. It's perfectly preserved. You can still see the deck planking. That blows my mind. The deck planking is teak. So it's a very dense wood, it's very hard wood. That's why it was often chosen alongside pine, which is softer, but it was chosen for the heavy wearing surfaces on ships. So typically, like handling decks, maneuvering decks, that kind of thing, like the forecastle of ocean liners, that kind of thing. But you can see that the paint has held up just fine. We've got a, Atlantic grey colour on the barbette itself, and then just below that, along the rim where it bordered the deck, you've got a black or a dark grey. You can also start to make out already what looks like some battle damage. So just down here on the bottom left, it looks like some kind of small hit, or maybe even a piece of shrapnel has just glanced off that. So Bismarck was shot to pieces, and one of the things that really amazed us when we were looking at the wreck is the degree of damage. So it's, there's a bit of dichotomy there. The wreck is beautifully preserved, but the ship itself is almost unrecognizable from the sheer amount of damage that she sustained. Crucially, of course, famously, when she sank, she rolled. So her 4 turrets, nicknamed Anton, Bruno, Caesar, and Dora, fell out. Dropped 5 kilometers to the bottom of the ocean. My understanding is they have been filmed, so hopefully Magellan will be releasing some more of that on their Patreon and their social media very soon. But what's very interesting about this is you get a real sense of the thickness of the barbet's armor. So you can actually see there's a little deep sea crustacean kind of chilling out on the edge of the barbet there. You can see just how thick these are. So that's about 34 centimeters of steel armor. The turret, of course, would have sat on top of that. You can see the teeth for the gears that would have rotated the turret once upon a time when it was sat there. But if not for the fact that the turret's missing, it's pretty remarkably intact. So we're flying past turret A and now heading back towards turret B because there's some really interesting things to talk about when we get there. But I just want to point out how eerie it is to see a ship that's been at the bottom of the ocean 85 years this year, I think, 1941, yeah, in this degree of preservation. So you've even got the hatch combing there over on the right next to that skylight little deck house. That would have been able to rig, an awning, like a canvas awning or something like that. Those are the hatches that let down into the crew quarters and the petty officers' quarters. But towering over all of it is the B turret barbette, which is what we see in the background here. So this is quite a tall structure, as you can see. It's extremely heavily reinforced because, the turrets are kind of like their own self-enclosed fighting units. They go stories deep, 3 or 4 stories down into the magazines at the bottom of the ship. So they have to be very, very heavily reinforced, of course. Still, as we're about to see, a shell got through. You can already start to see the hole, but we'll talk about that in a sec. Pointing out again, the paint still beautifully intact, totally fine. Even the thinner metal of the ventilation units that we're just passing here, ducts and things like that, it's all still really well intact, which is so bizarre to see. On Titanic, even though Titanic's 30 years older, I suppose, a lot of that steel is starting to go on those thinner units. So being able to see it on Bismarck intact is pretty remarkable. She's in better shape than some museum ships on the surface, that has to be said. But this is the star attraction of this video. This hit, that is a killer blow. So early in the engagement, Bismarck's B turret received a direct hit from HMS Rodney with its 16-inch shells. It's probable that was it. We'll have a look at that hole in a minute, but it's a remarkable piece of footage because it shows this shot just went straight through that barbette armor. That barbette armor is extremely thick. We get a beautiful shot here of the inside of the barbette. So very, very clearly now you can see the teeth for the turret's rotating mechanism. But you also notice those doublers. So there are these plates in place along the armored interior of the barbette. So where they're actually, doubling up the armor and joining it, in essence, acting like doublers on the outside of a ship's shell plating might, which is something I hadn't actually noticed before, to be honest with you. But you can see how deep down that barbette goes. And there's the hit. So what's interesting is it seems to have hit actually on the seam of where the barbette's armor actually joined, because you can see what looks like one of those doublers has just been bent and twisted inward by the impact. It hasn't actually detached, which is really interesting. But there is a perfect cross-section of the 34 centimeters of armor of Bismarck's B turret barbette, sliced through by one of those 16-inch battleship shells. This had dramatic consequences for the men in B turret. It was a huge hit. Battleship shells are timed with a fuse to arm after their initial impact. So the moment that shell hit that piece of armor and cut through it, the interior explosive charge, I forget how many pounds, but pounds of high explosive was armed, and it's clearly detonated then inside B turret. The result was the entire back of the B turret itself was blown clean off, and that turret was knocked out of action and the crew were killed. So you see this all over the wreck of Bismarck, just the individual moments of violence in the ship's final engagement, final moments. You see it absolutely all over the place. The bridge is an absolute mess. There's a lot of stories to tell, you know, maybe even more so than Titanic. You know, we look at Titanic, we see one of the lifeboat davits is pointing up towards the heavens, famously, where First Officer William Murdoch had ordered the davit to be brought back in so that a boat could be launched on it before the ship sank. But there's not many other little clues as to what happened that night around physically on the Titanic wreck. There's some, but there's not as many human touches and things. You know, there's not as many, you know, the iceberg damage is well beneath the sediment. Bismarck's very different. We can look at hits like this, give them a specific time, a specific ship that fired that shell, you know, the men who were inside this turret, we know who the gunnery officers were, you know, we know who was involved in this, we know who was probably killed by that hit alone. And Bismarck is covered in them. She was pounded to a bloody pulp, basically. So, you know, some of them are cruiser caliber hits, some of them are battleship caliber hits. It's pretty remarkable, yeah, because it gives you a very clear picture of what happened. So, you know, getting to see this in HD is extremely exciting. And this is just the very tip of the iceberg. But it's a great opening shot, pun actually not intended, from Magellan, because this is so evocative. You know, it shows Bismarck in her final moments, what happened, you know, the violence of what was being thrown at her, the sheer weight of metal that must have been up in the air. I love this shot coming up over the barbette top and looking down into the bottom of it, like the chasm of some giant, you know, cliff. It's amazing. For those of you who haven't been on a battleship before, I'd highly recommend visiting USS New Jersey, for example. I got to visit at the end of last year with some friends, and you know, they're quite similar in terms of their layout and their structure. You know, there's only so many ways you can build a battleship, I guess, and just imagining the force that it would take, you know, to punch through armor that thick. You walk up to it, you slap it. Of course, it's solid. You know what I mean? It's just amazing. The other thing that we're very fortunate with when it comes to Bismarck is the lack of sediment buildup. You'll notice that there's some sediment on the ring for the turret there, but not a lot. So it means that the ship's quite clear. And one of the things that was famously filmed on Bismarck back in the past, and again this time around, was the swastika on the deck. You know, it's just such a time capsule. It's really eerie. Unfortunately, of course, getting actually inside the wreck is another matter entirely. You know, the two ROVs that Magellan run, Romeo and Juliet, they're quite big, and they need to be big to support all the machinery, the cameras and equipment that they use to do their work. So they can't be sent inside. And, you know, Bismarck is still also a war grave. You know, a great many young men were killed in her sinking. So flying around it, getting an understanding of what happened to the ship is probably the extent of what we can expect from this campaign. But it puts a smile on my face seeing this stuff. You know, no one else is really doing this. I mean, visiting these historic sites, gathering this kind of data, and then making it accessible in this way is a really exciting thing. So fair play to Magellan for doing this. It will be very, very interesting flying around this in vROV pilot. So just to explain what the difference is and what's going on here, right? Magellan have visited the wreck and filmed it as much as they can. And from the passes that they conduct, going back and forth, they can take hundreds of thousands of photographs and then use photogrammetry to stitch those together to create a hyper-accurate digital twin. So it's not somebody's interpretation of what the wreck looks like. It's not a 3D model. It is literally a perfect carbon copy of the ship as it looks right now. So they did that with Titanic, quite famously. They've done it again with Bismarck. But in doing so, they've also captured hours and hours of actual footage of the wreck. So there are two really exciting bits of data that Magellan have generated here. We've got footage of the wreck, which we can talk about for hours. We've also got the digital twin, which is on the way. And they've put some previews up on their website, so definitely visit their Facebook or their website to check that out, because you can already start to see some of what they've been doing. I don't want to give too much away, because I'll be doing a lot of videos for Magellan on their YouTube channel and their Patreon, so be sure to go and follow them to check it all out. But we saw some pretty interesting stuff down there. We've learnt a couple of new things about Bismarck that nobody knew about before, which is very exciting. We tried to find certain things with varying degrees of success. We've just learned a lot about the ship. We've learnt a fair bit about her final moments, and Joe Lavender's been a huge help because his ability to interpret what he's seeing. You know me, I'm fascinated by battleships. I'm an Oceanliner guy at my core, but this will always be an area of interest to me. But you know, he is very much a subject matter expert on these things, and getting his interpretation of what he's seeing is very, very interesting. So you're not going to want to miss it. So very warm thank you to Magellan for providing this very exciting first glimpse at the Bismarck Wreck. This is haunting stuff. It's very eerie seeing this. I don't know if any of you guys have, what's it called? Submechanophobia. You know, the fear of submerged machinery. But looking down the barrel of that huge barbette over on the right, it's eerie. This is 5 kilometers deep. It's over 2.5 miles, right? Absolutely unbelievable stuff. So it's an exciting new chapter in the Bismarck story. So we will be there all the way. Be sure to follow Magellan. If you want me to make a video with Joe, if you want us to highlight any specific areas, if you've got any questions about the Bismarck and what's going on, I will make a Q&A and put it on the top pinned comment. So feel free to ask your questions of us, of Magellan, and we will be sure to answer what we can. So thank you so very much for watching. We're, as you can tell, all very excited by this, and there is plenty more to come. So as always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. And as always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.